Hello, and welcome back to another fun-filled episode of the Hammercast. I am your host, Alex, the Hebrew Hammer Salkin, and joining me today is Norwegian strength specialist Berge Fagerli. Hopefully, I've pronounced his name decently. He's given me a smile, so I think that's not bad for an American, which is very, very good. Got a thumbs up even. We are going to be talking about some of his contributions to the world of strength training, specifically myo-reps, which is a very fascinating way to get some really incredible results in your strength and muscularity in a very short period of time, and kind of the science behind it as well. So before we kick things off, for those of you who are brand new here, if you have not already gotten my 9-minute kettlebell and bodyweight challenge, I highly recommend that you do that. It is, as the name implies, only 9 minutes long, and it's designed to be done in conjunction with your regular training as opposed to in place of it. So you don't have to take a detour, completely scrap all your plans, and you can start making some pretty good gains, specifically by learning how to strengthen your body through your gait pattern. So things like crawling, loaded carries, things of that nature tends to be a very nice complement to a regular strength training program. And it's free. So who can complain about that? Just go to 9minutechallenge.com and get your own free copy. And that is the number 9minutechallenge.com. So Berge, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting. It's an honor.
Now, well, the honor is all mine, in particular because, I have followed your work for some time. I see your name pop up amongst all the top guys in the world of strength and hypertrophy training, from people like Dr. Mike Israetel, Paul Carter, Arnold Schwarzenegger mentioned you recently in one of his email blasts. And I thought, well, there couldn't possibly be a higher compliment than that. And it makes me wonder, a guy with such an incredible impact on the training world. I always like to figure out what their origin story was. So were you always interested in strength training or physical activity, or was this something that you kind of got interested in later in life?
Well, I had an interest from an early age, but, I wasn't physically able to keep up with my peers. So, I was a huge fan of action movies and superhero movies and that kind of stuff. So, having big muscles to me symbolized, admiration and confidence and all the stuff that I didn't have. So I guess to kind of compensate for that, I just got interested in, I used to do the normal stuff. I used to play soccer with my friends, and I was really into martial arts. So I did some karate. I was really into the 80s ninja movies. So I would be running around with, hoods and pretend to be a ninja and disappear in a cloud of smoke. But beyond that, I wouldn't say I was, I was never particularly athletic. So I would always have friends that were way stronger and faster and better than me. But I was a smart kid. So, I was good at school. I learned to read when I was like 4 or 5 years old. Learned to do advanced math at an early age. So I quickly realized that I could consume a lot of information, and I could piece it together and apply it in practice. And I could also teach others. I would get some decent results in myself. So I would go to the library and just get books on everything I was interested in, whether it was soccer or ninjutsu or, archery, or I would just keep switching interests, I guess, to figure out my niche. And would get half decent results myself, but I would just be really happy to share with everyone that cared to listen. So I was, kind of quickly known as the knowledgeable guy. And so once I got into high school, actually, I spent a year in Kansas in high school when I was 15 to 16, and we had 1 hour of weightlifting. And I was obviously the weaker guy as well, but really impressed by the bigger and stronger guys. And I would, kind of give some small hints and tips here and there. And we're like, wow, that stuff you told me about, Borg, that really worked. Where did you learn that? And that was kind of my self-confidence boost. So once the internet kind of took off, I started studying engineering in '97. And I started writing articles and posting on discussion boards. That was like the big thing back then. And people would start asking me questions, sending me messages. Hey, can you help me with programming? And I guess the rest is history. I mean, that's when I realized that whenever I shared my knowledge with others, they would get incredible results. And I would get half decent results myself. So if I would rely only on my own physical results, I would probably not be where I'm at today. But it, something was working, even though it was only working half as well for me as for everyone else. So I got my kind of boost or motivation to see that others would succeed whenever I shared my knowledge with them.
I think there's also something very encouraging, like what you're saying, when other people are being helped, not only because you can see that you're making a difference in the world, but that you can see that, the ideas that you've synthesized through all the other things that you've learned weren't just this sort of a thing where it's like n equals 1 and you are n, like this is one of the criticisms that a lot of people have of the personal training industry in general. There's a lot of people who get involved because they're essentially, let's say, hobbyists who want to get paid, and they know what works for them, but what works for them doesn't necessarily work for other people. And like, you're pointing out, maybe you don't have any specific physical gifts like others, but those who do, if they're even noticing an improvement, it's not just something that will work on one level or for one kind of person. These are actually concepts that can be distilled into principles that others can apply as well. Now, when you started realizing this, what got you interested in making this a career? Because for a lot of people, they think, okay, well, this is something that's pretty cool. It works very well, but how am I ever going to make money from this? Was this a sort of a thing that you eventually became, this eventually became your primary gig? Or was this a sort of a thing like right out of college, you were like, all right, I'm going to jump in feet first and I'm going to start making this a full-time job?
No, I mean, it started with people just offering to pay me. And, $100 to run a training program was when I was studying to be an engineer, and I had probably $600 per month to live on, and that was I had to pay the rent and food with that money, so it wasn't a whole lot. So $100 was a lot of money, and after finishing my education, I worked for maybe 2 years. One of them was in New York, actually. And this was in 2001. So people can probably remember what happened in 2001.
Yeah, an interesting time to be living in New York as a foreigner, I'm sure.
Yes, that's definitely what it was. And I left in June, late June. And I was planning to go back, but obviously never did. So that was just crazy watching the footage of 9/11 play out on TV. And, but the thing is, what happened with the whole industry, I was working in IT, and it just collapsed. I mean, the company I was working for had 150 offices around the world, and that dwindled down to 20 over the course of maybe 9 months. And the whole Norwegian department was shut down. I lost my job. So I was basically unemployed for almost a full year. And during that time, I just, had, $100 here and there on training programs. And I just, at the time, I was really posting a lot on the hypertrophy specific training forum, Brian Haycock's forum, HST training. And I just created this whole FAQ. And there was this Norwegian Ironman magazine at the time. It was basically just a translated version of the American one. Some select few articles and a few Norwegian ones. So I figured I would just send them an article series on HST. And they really loved it. And the people behind it ran a supplement company. So they, after 2 months or something, they just called me and asked me to come in for a job interview. And I came in there, and there was a lot of applicants, and I was the one they selected, and started working there as a consultant, developing supplements, but also answering questions on their own discussion forum. I also then created this 12-week transformation program that really took off. It was just huge at the time in Norway. And because they had, like, the first prize was a car. So, it really spread. And I started doing seminars around the country. And I worked there for 2, maybe 3 years. And on the side of that, I also had some coaching. And I started getting results with athletes, with fitness competitors, with bodybuilding. And that was the point I realized that I could make a career out of this, because the guys and girls I was helping started winning contests. So the others in the gym, like, there was a gym connected to this company, and they were just doing the typical high volume stuff, 6 meals a day, all of that, I would say bro science stuff, which wasn't completely wrong, but everyone was doing the same thing, and there was no individualizing. So I would help maybe 2 or 3 competitors, and they all placed in the top 3. So people started noticing that and contacted me, and that's, I guess, where it just kind of started to scale. And I would quickly become known, since during that time I also published articles and posted online, and I was on a guest on podcast and at that time, and I just got to be very famous as the go-to guy for training and nutrition.
That has to have felt pretty good. Not only do you get hired by a major magazine and above a bunch of other folks, but now you're helping people who maybe have never even heard of the message boards that you're posting on, and you're reaching an even wider audience. You're building up this acclaim, and in some sense, you're also fighting against the bro science out there, which I think we would all agree is, like, there's a measure of good to it and also a measure of bad, because sometimes it's like people just do things because they're like, oh well, Ronnie Coleman did this, so why don't I just do it? And then other times there are some of the bros in the bro science world who are actually looking to get incredible results, and they'll do, we'll say, like a quasi-scientific approach to seeing what works and what doesn't. But there's just not as much of a differentiation between the wheat and the chaff, as we would say. Now, I'm curious in particular because I know that rest pause training got its start in bodybuilding. I remember reading something many years ago about Sergio Oliva was big on rest pause training, and of course, there is certainly something to it, because this is, in some sense, sort of the precursor to myo-reps. So as a slight detour, like, where do you think the bro science, quote unquote, is on target in many cases, and where do you think it's completely off target in many cases?
I think this isn't really particular to bodybuilding. I think it's common in all sports that there will always be coaches and trainers that do things out of tradition. And if everyone is doing it, you kind of need to be really confident and maybe have some type of arrogance, I guess, to dare to defy that and go your own ways. So and sometimes, you go against the grain and you try to do other stuff and it doesn't work, and then it kind of just fizzles out. Whereas I always try to figure out, okay, if it doesn't work, why doesn't it work? And for whom? So over time, I started to just get more pieces of the puzzle and see where did that particular piece fit, instead of just throwing it away because it didn't fit where I first tried to place it. And so what I always keep saying is that the picture is probably just going to be the same. It's the same picture, but we're beginning to get more pieces of the picture and more details. We can see more nuance. We can see more context. We can see I believe the future of training and nutrition is the individualizing aspect. Because right now, still, after all of these years and all of this science, we're still fighting online on who's right and who's wrong. Instead of kind of respecting, well, maybe you are right on yourself, but that doesn't work for me, and this is why. And so instead, if we started just talking together and trying to create some kind of common platform of understanding, instead of pointing fingers and projecting insecurities and saying, well, you're wrong and I'm right, and just making it into this huge ego contest, then we would probably be there already. So
yeah, I think it's a very salient point, because one of the things that I certainly notice quite a bit of is that sometimes it comes from the bro science crowd, sometimes it comes from the peer-reviewed study kind of crowd, is that they want to try to say this way is the only way, but nobody ever asked the question, okay, well then why does this other way even exist if it's never worked for anybody? So is there a context where 6 meals a day might be the best approach versus 4, or is there a context where 2 times a day training might be better versus once every 3 days or something like that? And so I think you're really on to something with the individualization part of it, because there might be certain things that everybody needs and certain principles everyone needs to follow, but where things really diverge is in the tactics, and it seems like that's where everybody is getting it seems like that's where all the ego is, and the finger pointing and things like that.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. And what I noticed over the years is that depending on who was asking and what client they were asking, they would think that, well, Borg is the low carb guy, or Borg is the high carb guy, Borg is the this or that.
Right.
But what they were saying is that in that particular client, we had already tried the other approaches and they didn't work. Or we tried a particular approach that I kind of guessed, had an educated guess would work, and it did work. But sometimes it didn't. And then we had to try something else. And just like you said, I've had clients with 6 meals a day. I've had clients with 1 and 2 meals a day. And sometimes at the same time. So it's not as if I went through periods where I trended towards and was attracted to certain types of dietary philosophies. I've been full of biases myself, but I was always aware of them. Not always, there were times I wasn't, but I'm like a first principles kind of guy, where I keep asking, can I find evidence that this is true? And likewise, can I find evidence that this is not true? What if the opposite was true? And so weigh those against each other. And then again, dig deeper and ask for whom and when. And so that, I believe, not only requires a lot of humility and sometimes a touch of imposter syndrome, but I guess just being open to being wrong all the time, and trying to sort of figure out what specifically is underlying the mechanisms. What makes that work so well for this person but not that person?
Yeah.
And some of that stuff I still don't know, but I can just, I guess, get some sort of intuition for it, which is basically just your subconscious knowing before your conscious does.
Big time. Yeah, I think that the other thing to keep in mind too is you talked about tradition, and so often there are different communities where the tradition like seeps in, and they don't realize that what they're talking about is not necessarily tried and true for absolutely everybody, but it really comes down to like, well, this is just the way we've always done things. You mentioned the sports side of things, and I think about old school boxing coaches who never let their trainees lift weight. It's like everything has to be high rep calisthenics, which does work very well for some people. I know Mike Tyson did a lot of that, but Mike Tyson's also Mike Tyson, and he was 12 years old beating up grown men. So maybe you can't say, this is going to work for me as well. Now, on the topic of this, there's also I think one of the things I have seen very often, let's say, is that people in the hypertrophy camp versus the strength camp are sometimes at odds with each other, and they'll say, well, you should, like the strength camp might say never train to failure, and the hypertrophy camp might say always train to failure or pretty close to it. And the reason they can't really talk with each other is because even though there's obviously a fair amount of crossover between the things that they're doing, again, they're getting mired down in the tactics and some of the minutia as opposed to looking for the commonalities. So for the folks who are, let's say, less interested in building muscle, but more interested in building strength, and the folks who are more interested in building muscle and less interested in building strength, what are the commonalities between the two that people can start with and realize, okay, if my goals are pulling me in one direction, like hypertrophy, or just pure strength, that it's going to be an easy switch? Like, what are some of the things that those two things have in common?
Wow, that's a great question. So first off, there's like good research looking at the best powerlifters, and the correlation between muscle mass and strength is so good at the top level that you can basically estimate how good that powerlifter is going to be based off of their lean muscle mass, which is, almost unheard of in strength science. So it's kind of impossible to separate completely, because a bigger muscle is generally going to be a stronger muscle as long as you can activate it neurally. So you can basically say you have the engine and you have the driver, where the engine is the muscle itself, and the bigger engine, the faster you can go, but you also need a competent driver to handle that engine. So I kind of tend to agree that in general terms, you don't need to go to failure for strength. It can, in fact, be counterproductive because it induces so much fatigue that in order for the optimal strength development, you probably need to stay at least 2 or maybe 3 reps from failure in order to be able to practice as often as possible, because strength is also a skill. So being able to do it more often, like more frequently, we have the probably infamous Norwegian frequency project at this point in time that compared training 6 times a week and 3 times per week. And it was a clear benefit to 6 times per week, not only in strength, but also hypertrophy. But that's kind of a different discussion, because they still don't train that way for hypertrophy. They claim this is mainly for strength. And so being able to do a lift more often, and with perhaps less reps per set, because let's face it, to be strong, you need to lift heavy weights. But lifting heavy weights for 5 reps with your 5 rep max is going to be very fatiguing. And it's also going to be right on the verge of creating more hypertrophy. Like it's definitely going to create more hypertrophy than, say, for instance, at this point, it's probably a wash, but if you did 3 sets of 2 reps with the same load that you did 1 set of 5 reps with, we could argue that for hypertrophy, they're pretty much equal. But for strength, the 3 sets of 2 is going to be slightly better. But if you want to prioritize strength and de-emphasize hypertrophy, you're probably going to have to limit total volume. And if you go all the way to weightlifting, which is limited by weight classes, and they just really want to max out their absolute strength relative to their body weights, they're probably just going to be doing sets of 1 to 3 reps. And they're also limiting the eccentric components, so just letting the weight free fall. And it's also going to be very explosive lifting and less so grinding. So the more you kind of grind, the more the rep speed slows down, which also implies that you're getting closer to the point of failure. The more mechanical tension is applied to each muscle fiber, you're also activating and recruiting more muscle fibers, and the more hypertrophy each repetition is going to generate. So this is where we also have research showing that a set of 5 and a set of 30, as long as you're at the same proximity to failure, is pretty much equal in terms of muscle growth. this probably, like the slope of the curve here is probably going to be different depending on the exercise, the advancement, training level, even gender, individual and genetic differences. So I would say it's probably more important to go closer to failure the lighter loads you're doing for hypertrophy.
Mm-hmm.
And for strength, I think most will agree that you need to be lifting closer to your 1 rep max for it to be more specific for displaying 1 rep max, because that's basically the specific, the specific adaptation principle of imposed demands.
Certainly.
But beyond that, there's like good research showing. So if you're in the middle here, if you're between 5 and 30 reps somewhere, like say if you're doing a 10 to 15 rep max load, there was one study comparing 3 sets of 10 reps to a study comparing 6 sets of 5 reps with the same load. And in this study, 3 sets of 10 was better for muscle growth, 6 sets of 5 was inferior for muscle growth, but equal in strength. So strength seems to be the same because the total volume was the same, total number of reps, but you kind of need at that loading range to be slightly closer to failure. And there was another study comparing 5 sets of 5 to 3 sets to failure, which was also 25 total reps, but every set was taken to failure. And there was also like maybe not a very clear difference, but there was an advantage to 3 sets to failure versus 5 sets of 5.
Mm-hmm.
The 5 sets of 5 trended to be at worst equal in strength, but some actually gained a little more strength.
Interesting.
Because you had 5 sets to practice instead of 3 sets.
Yeah, and that seems to be the big factor here is the matter of practice. And, I like the way that you described a muscle as being like the engine, whereas we might say like the nervous system as being like the driver. And so you can take the exact same weight, and the way that you train it might help you to either improve the size of the engine or improve the skill of the driver. Now, would you say that there is some value for people on either end of the spectrum? Let's say, I'm mostly interested in strength versus I'm mostly interested in hypertrophy. And every once in a while, crossing over to the other side and spending a little bit of time there in order to, let's say, fill in any gaps or improve some asymmetries that they might have on one side or the other. Let's say, like you're having a hard time getting past that 3 sets of 10 reps with a given weight. So maybe you spend a little time doing 6 sets of 5. And now you go back a couple months later, and all of a sudden you're finding that you can go harder with the 3 sets of 10 by lifting more weight or something along those lines. Does that have value for people who are interested in one side over the other?
Yeah, I mean, another great question, because we have good research that that really strengthens precisely that sentiment. So there's one study that looked at sequencing. So they did a strength phase prior to hypertrophy phase. And in this study, there was a clear advantage in hypertrophy if you did a strength phase first. Mm-hmm. So lower reps, lower volumes, closer to 1 rep max, because this pushes up, the driver's experience basically. And now you can build the engine to be bigger as well. Also, there was like this Swedish bachelor's thesis. That's the only reason I know about it, I guess, is because, there was some discussion about it a few years ago, but I knew about it because a friend of mine, Matthias Wernbaum, was the advisor of these students. And he just, sent me this and said, "Hey, Borge, have you seen this? This is just amazing what these guys have done." And they recruited a few of the students at the school. And they did like an undulating periodization program, basically just doing low reps, cycling between, I believe it was 4 and 10 reps for 3 weeks out of every 4 weeks. And every 4th week, they did blood flow restriction training with high reps, like 30 rep sets, only for that week. Mm-hmm. And then went back to the normal training afterwards. Now, the results after that study was one of the most impressive cross-sectional area gains ever seen in any study throughout history. And so what I'm thinking, because I've discussed this with Matthias several times, you know, he was really well known for the blood flow restriction training. Mm-hmm. He also wrote a very impressive meta-analysis in 2006 or 2004, I believe, which was like this huge meta on frequency, volume, and intensity. And so you can probably find it. It's been cited hundreds and thousands of times. And so we would kind of go back and forth on this, because he had his lab at the Olympic Center in Norway, where they also studied not only elite athletes but also powerlifters. And he couldn't explain it at the time, and we probably still can't, but there's something going on with this type of high rep training. And, you know, occlusion training is just a way to allow you to use even lighter loads and still achieve higher recruitment levels. So I believe at this point, you can probably get there. That this is the foundation of me developing Myo-Reps, because I'm kind of trying to simulate the same effect by just keeping constant tension on the muscle and doing a rest pause approach, and managing fatigue in order to get in sufficient amount of volume. So we're going to get back to that later. But doing this type of training, maybe not every 4th week, but perhaps every 6 to 8 weeks or something around those lines, for 1 to 3 weeks, does seem to, perhaps it's only glycogen. He speculated that there's some type of satellite cell or ribosome biogenesis effect going on, but we still don't have any hard data saying that that's what's going on. Because, I mean, there's other research showing that metabolic stress isn't really a thing. It probably just generates fatigue, and it perhaps even limits hypertrophy, but it doesn't, you know, enhance it. But something is going on that I just can't explain. And it does seem to improve, because in this case, these were powerlifters that were pretty much maxed out in their weight class. And they hadn't been gaining much the last 6 to 12 months. After doing, I believe it was only 2 to 3 weeks of this type of training, they now started gaining again. So perhaps, to answer your question, perhaps there's something to getting stronger and still doing some type of hypertrophy-specific training, high rep training, volumizing, glycogen, whatever is going on. But they were definitely improving their power lifts after doing just blood flow restriction training with, you know, 20 to 30 rep sets and, you know, burning and pumping and all that stuff. So yeah, I do believe there's value in doing both, regardless of your chosen sport or goal, interspersed with your normal training.
That's very fascinating. And, you know, it sort of answers a supposition that I've always had, that was kind of the case, that, you know, you can focus on, because I come from a background which is kind of more focused on strength and a little bit less on muscle, more like, you know, whatever muscle you get from your strength training, that's sort of, you know, something to celebrate, but it's not the primary goal. But I've always thought that one of the things that I've noticed with my clients and the people who, you know, follow me and things like that, is that when they start to see that they have had an extended period of time of frustrating lack of improvement in anything, what they really need to do is change their approach. And it doesn't mean, you know, you hang up your weights and you take up yoga or, you know, Pilates or what have you, but rather that you sort of take a little bit of a detour, because that might actually be a much faster track to getting you back to where you're going. And this is I think it's always very good to look at the people on either ends of the extremes, like the extremely strong powerlifters or the, you know, the totally weak, you know, beginners starting at from square one, and see what works there, because very often you can make some suppositions about what's going on in the middle. And you brought up a very interesting point too that I want to ask you about, because there seems to be an almost dogmatic insistence by some that 5 to 8 rep sets are really all that's necessary to build muscle, because, you know, you've only got those 5 stimulating reps if your goal is to build muscle. But to me, it seems like, and this is, who knows if this is bro science or not, I'm sure you'll be able to clarify. There are some muscle groups that seem like they respond a bit better to higher rep ranges, and that there might even be some benefit to higher rep ranges, even if, let's say that you're doing a set of 30 and the last 5 are the only stimulating reps. There may be some other benefits that would still make it worthwhile to occasionally do some, much higher rep sets as opposed to the lower to moderate rep. What are your thoughts on that? Are there some muscle groups or certain strategies where it would make sense to aim for much higher reps for hypertrophy?
I'm one of the first guys to agree that if you were to bend my arm and ask me what's the best rep range, I would probably agree that 5 to 8 reps is the sweet spot for muscle growth and strength. Mm-hmm. But I still don't want to discount other rep ranges, simply because, from whether it's perception, whether it's psychology, whether it's some physiological underlying reason for it, fiber type makeup, every theory you can throw at me, there's probably a study saying that this can't be the case. But again, I try to keep one foot in evidence-based camp with all of the research and science, but I worked with between 4,000 and 5,000 clients over 25 years, and I've seen patterns and trends that I just can't always explain with science or research. So what research is like an observation of the real world and trying to figure out through a hypothesis, is this right or is it wrong? And so it's pretty much always going to be a study of averages. And it's kind of simple. I mean, we also have studies showing that when people are able to self-select a rep range, they get better gains. Mm-hmm. When people get to self-select their exercises, they get better gains. So there's a huge, I've had a client that whenever we went below 10 reps in any exercise, everything just got stuck. And she just hated training. She, just kept telling me, I don't want to do this. I'm not looking forward to training anymore. Please change my program. Went back to 12 to 15 reps. She loved training again, and everything was gaining. Mm-hmm. So, again, are you type 1 dominant? Do you just prefer endurance training? Do you have a certain neurological, psychological makeup? Are you more, you prefer things that are sustained over a long period of time? Are you more impulsive? We can start discussing dopamine and serotonin and even the neurobiological mechanisms. But I do think that if you're stuck, sometimes it's a volume and frequency issue. Very often it is. There's an imbalance between the volume and frequency, and you probably accumulated fatigue over time, because that's also possible. Even though some say, well, it's just acute. I just have to ask, well, did you ever get a sunburn and try to go out in the sunlight the day after? It's going to get a worse sunburn. Mm-hmm. So I'm just going to have to say that I encourage everyone to experiment. Mm-hmm. Even my own program and course lays out a strategy for systematically trying to figure out your own volume and frequency upper and lower bounds. Mm-hmm. And then a strong emphasis on, well, these are perhaps my go-to rep ranges, but I would encourage everyone to experiment. So if you prefer higher reps, then do that. And even like we just talked about here, that once in a while do higher reps, once in a while do lower reps. See what happens. Perhaps you're surprised, that, well, I never thought this would work, and then it did. Mm-hmm. And even so, just doing higher reps and perhaps more volume once in a while, just to deplete more glycogen. And obviously, if you're not on the keto diet, then you're going to get more swelling, and the muscle is going to look fuller. I've done contest prep for many, many years, and I've seen the difference. It can be night and day just introducing high rep training to a lifter. Mm-hmm. So even even though there's no hypertrophic benefit to it, there's definitely a visual benefit to it. And sometimes that's enough for some people. So let's not get so deep into the physiology and the models that we forget that we're also working with humans here.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, kind of like we talked about earlier, there's an individualization approach that needs to be considered, because for some people, you know, they could do everything by the book and it'll work great. Or like you've pointed out, there's some people that they need to do things in their own way, and that actually is what gets them the results they're after, like objectively speaking, meaning they wanted to get better muscles, or get let's say bigger muscles. And then there are folks who need a little bit of both. Now I'm curious what if you think that there is any. Now I know you said that, you know, we can't really know in some sense, but if you could make some sort of a supposition, like, do you think that if you've gone an extended amount of time without doing a whole lot of training directly for the, let's say like the type 2 muscles or the endurance muscle fibers, or even stuff like tendons and ligaments, like if they're kind of lagging behind and they need some direct attention, if that might also have an effect on the ultimate results?
Yeah, and I mean, this is basically, by doing one type of training, there will probably be some bottlenecks somewhere. And I mean, we have optimal loading ranges for type 2 fibers and type 1 fibers, and tendons and ligaments probably need some type of minimum loading to get, since they have a really slow metabolism and protein turnover. So they probably need more frequent stimulus and a certain minimum threshold of stimulus without overdoing it, because that will, you know, lead to inflammation and tendinitis and tendonitis. So, yeah, I think it's, to me, coaching is more an art than a science, or at least a little of both. So you need to be aware of, I always ask my new clients, what have you been doing? What's been working and what hasn't been working? And do you perhaps have any guesses why? And then based off of their history, I can create a strategy, but sometimes we have to, you know, refer back to what has been working well previously and in what context, and just make educated guesses based off of that. So yeah, I would say if you've been training with higher reps for a long, long time, then perhaps it's time to introduce some heavier loading and vice versa. But that's probably going to be the best model we have, instead of thinking, well, there's only going to be this one perfect sweet spot that everyone needs to be doing. And the further you are away from that, then the more wrong you are.
Right.
Because that seems to be kind of the thing going on in social media these days. And everyone, again, has their own favorite model. So I kind of try to have, you know, be more diplomatic here and say, well, you're not wrong, but maybe you're not right 100% of the time either.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the difference between being an influencer and being a researcher, is that ability to help people understand the nuance between the two. And most people would rather have a simple answer that's either wrong or only situationally correct than, you know, have the smorgasbord of answers in front of them and then have to choose, oh, I have to really look deeply and say, where am I right now? What do I want to accomplish? So on and so forth, and then select the right answer from there. It seems to be a little less common approach, but from my perspective, that's the one that also works the best. Now, I want to talk to you specifically about myo-reps, because again, that's the thing that I think, out of all of your accomplishments and your 25 years of training, that's the one thing that I think people have most attached you with, and perhaps for good reason, because it has a pedigree for creating some really, really impressive results. So what was the like origin of your pioneering of myo-reps, and how do they work, and how do they differ from the rest pause reps?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the HST board, and Brian Haycock is just an amazing guy and knowledgeable. And I guess we were just kind of looking at the motor recruitment patterns and the Henneman size principle, and that's back when I created the effective reps model, which just posits that you kind of need to, at lighter loads, you need to do more reps to get to activate the higher threshold, stronger fibers. And that's basically it. And again, the slope to get there will probably vary a lot. So since mechanical tension is the primary signal, there's probably others, but I would say that that's probably the primary signal. To apply mechanical tension to all muscle fibers in the muscle, it needs to have a certain level of fatigue, or the weight needs to be heavy enough. So up to around 5 to 8 rep max, we're probably getting close to full recruitment from the very first rep. And the load will also be moving sufficiently slow to apply mechanical tension and signal growth. So at that point, every rep is probably close to equal. The lighter loads you do, the more reps you need to do to fatigue, to get a certain minimum level of fatigue in order to access the higher threshold fibers. And so that's where, to me, it seems as if the lighter loads you do, the closer you need to get to failure to get to that point where rep speed slows down and motor unit recruitment is sufficiently high to actually stimulate full muscle growth. Now, another way to get there is just to do more sets with that load. So you will slowly accumulate fatigue, and that will lower the threshold to activate all of the muscle fibers. So there's many ways to get there, but basically what I thought, well, why not try to be as efficient as possible? Why spend so many sets and reps to get there? Since we're getting there by just doing reps closer to failure, and since we also know that going to absolute failure creates so much fatigue that it's probably going to limit recruitment. It's going to limit how many total reps you can achieve. I mean, everyone that's ever done like a set of 20 reps to failure, absolute failure. I'm not talking squats here because you probably won't dare to go to absolute failure. But let's say a bicep curl, that's going to be safe. It's going to be feasible for most to reach absolute failure. Now, rest 2 to 3 minutes. Can you still achieve 20 reps? If you're able to recruit all of your muscle fibers and not being stopped by perception of effort, but actual neuromuscular fatigue, then you're probably only going to get 15 reps on the next set. So within those constraints, I think that let's modulate fatigue. So the typical rest pause technique is basically just extending a set by inserting short rest periods. And that's basically just chasing fatigue, getting as fatigued as possible, because it's based off of the belief that the more fatigue, the more stimulus. But looking at the fatigue research, which is probably bigger than the whole hypertrophy and strength science in total, there's just so much more looking at fatigue because it's also related to sports. And understanding the physiology of fatigue, now you begin to see that, well, the closer to failure you go and the more fatigue you create, the less mechanical tension and neurological, the less recruitment you're going to achieve. So I think let's stay 1 to 2 reps from reserve, because that's already close enough to failure to get, the stimulus we need, but it's not as many reps as it takes to generate a lot of fatigue. So it's just going to balance that point. And let's stay there. So let's insert a short period of rest so we can regenerate some phosphocreatine and ATP, and extend the set by doing some more reps, and just balance, stay at that balance point. So now you're managing fatigue in order to get in more total reps at a high recruitment level and high mechanical tension. So that's Myo-Reps in a nutshell. So it's less needed at a 5 to 8 rep range with a 5 to 8 rep max load, because now all of the reps are as effective as possible. So you could probably just be doing sets of 3 reps and get the same stimulus. But beyond that, like from 8 to 20 reps, I do believe there's a benefit to just getting, what I call the activation set, getting a high level of activation and modulating, managing fatigue, and then just getting in more effective reps at that point by inserting short rest periods and trying to stay at that point. Now, at some level, you're still going to generate so much fatigue that I have a hard stop at 5-minute sets. So whether that's like 3-3, 3-3-3, or 5-5-5-5, probably more fatigue with the 5-5-5s. So, but I think doing more than perhaps 15 to 20 reps total in the mini rep series is going to be a hard stop.
Right.
And so at that point, you're probably better off just doing straight sets.
Yeah, that's I think that sounds very fascinating, because what it sounds like to me is essentially you are trying to find those stimulating reps, and your first set is close enough to failure that it's getting you some fatigue. And once you've gotten that, let's say, set of 10, 12 out of the way, something along those lines, you can start doing sets of, we'll say, between like 3 and 5. I know that, some people will go as low as, 1 to 2. Yeah. And with the idea being that once you can no longer get the same number of reps that you got with the previous mini sets, that's your last set, and you don't keep pushing it because enough fatigue is already set in that you don't want to have to overdo it on your recovery time. And in particular, it sounds like this also differs a bit from the standard rest pause method, which is where you'd be between, let's say, 70 to 90% of your 1 rep max. This approach works a bit better with moderate and lighter weights, and gets you essentially the same results, or maybe even better results, because you're able to get in more stimulating reps than you might by going really heavy and just building up all this fatigue and not really being able to recover in a timely fashion. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because the more fatigue you generate, the more recovery it's going to require. So I've had people try to do myo-reps and probably going too close to failure and doing too many reps and doing it on full body workouts 3 times per week, and that was just too hard to recover from for some. But I think that the most well-known rest pause technique at the other side of the spectrum is dock wrap or DC training, and that's got 3 failure points. So you go to failure on each of those mini sets. So it's basically, let's say, 12 reps to failure. Short rest, now you get maybe 5 reps. Short rest, and now you get maybe 3 reps. And now you're done. And that's all you do for that muscle group. But what I think is, by managing fatigue, you could get in, you can modulate and manage fatigue slightly better, and you could get in slightly more volume for that fatigue cost.
And now, is this let's say you're going to do something like pull-ups, for instance, for for your myo-reps. Well, first question actually would be, does this work every bit as well for compound exercises as it does for isolation exercises, provided that it's within the proper rep range?
Yes, sort of. I would probably refrain from using it on squats, deadlifts, bent rows, things of that nature, where there's a cardiovascular requirement that you're just going to be too winded to be able to complete it. And or you have some lower back fatigue, just isometrically, statically trying to keep your upper body in position bent over. That's going to limit you. Grip might be a limiting factor. So like remaining deadlifts without wrist straps is going to be a problem. I also think it's too cumbersome to get weights, the dumbbells into place on shoulder press and dumbbell bench press. So I probably wouldn't be using it on those either. But there's people that successfully done it, so it's certainly possible. But the more energy you have to spend getting the weight back down and back up again, the more wasteful that's going to be. So I kind of prefer machines, isolation exercises, and chins and pull-ups are also going to be fine.
Yeah, that does make sense. So basically, any energy that is not going into the actual performance of the target exercise, unless you can find some way to mitigate it or what have you, you might just end up eating into some of the effective reps that you're able to do because, the fatigue is just going to be building up beyond whatever's reasonable at that point.
Yeah, and I mean, I would probably also not do it on Bulgarian split squats. I mean, I've had clients do them, and they just hated me afterwards. So
I think that's a pretty common approach. Anybody who has to do Bulgarian split squats is like, oh, these are terrible. But myo-reps are not. They're just a tough exercise. So some people bristle at the very thought of doing them. Now, with this in mind too, because there's some sort of management of fatigue with this, and we're not necessarily going to failure, but we're leaving, let's say, 1 to 2 reps in reserve no matter what. Can myo-rep
at the very end, I would say that at the very end, you can go to failure if you want to. You probably it's hard to avoid going to failure on the very last mini set, simply because you're kind of pushing the volume there. And some even argue that this is what makes myo-rep so effective, because most people aren't used to pushing closer to failure at all, and this kind of forces you to, whether you want to or not.
Interesting.
So yeah, there's definitely some benefits there.
Very cool. Does this sort of approach, in your experience, does myo-rep training also work well for people who, let's say, they play a sport? Might depend on what sport it is that they're playing, because the great thing about it is you can get in and out in maybe 30 minutes max if you're doing something like this, and you don't necessarily need the super high frequency like you might for a strength only program. Does it have any value or application for sports? And if so, are there some sports it might work for better and some that may not be a great idea for?
I like using it for any type of martial artist or fighter. That's like a huge benefit. I also like the mid endurance crossover type training, but if we're talking like purely endurance athletes, I probably wouldn't use it as much. I tend to use just more powerlifting oriented, maybe not powerlifting exercises, but I'll do low rep stuff and lower volume stuff for runners and those who have like high impact sports. But generally, since it's time efficient, you're in and out of the gym. It's got definitely some muscular endurance overlap with many sports. So it has a time and place, and I've used it for many years with different types of sports and athletes.
Awesome. And I would imagine then that like maybe the closer an athlete gets to a competition, the more you might leave it out so that they can be more prepared. Yeah,
exactly. So and that's basically where we taper all type of non-specific sports training anyway. So I mean, a bicyclist or a runner in season, we're just going to go into the gym and do some maintenance stuff maybe once a week.
Very cool. Well, this has been a really awesome interview, and I would love it if all of my listeners would follow you and maybe buy a bunch of your stuff and give you the support that you so sorely deserve. Where can people follow you online? And in particular, tell us a little bit about the last program.
Yeah, you can usually find me on Instagram now. I'm slowly transitioning to TikTok just to experiment. I'm going to be doing more YouTube because I prefer long form content, but I'm trying to experiment with shorter form content and getting to the point, which you probably understood from this interview that I have a problem with. So those are the main places. Facebook is kind of dead, so it's just cross posting mainly. But my homepage is borgefagerli.com. That's also where you can find the Myo-Reps article and the last program, which is just a culmination of my 25 years as a coach, and it's highly emphasizing the individualizing component where you learn how to figure out what works best for you. And that's kind of been the hard sell for me because most just want to be told what to do. So I'm in the process of also developing some just, let's say, cookie cutter program that you just follow along in order to figure out what works best for you, where I just tell you every step of the way what to do. But the last program is just diet, nutrition, even mindset and lifestyle. That just all goes together in order to manage your stress, your sleep, recovery and optimize everything in terms of strength, muscle growth, endurance, and getting lean and strong.
Very cool. Folks, be sure to check it out. There is going to be a series of links in the show notes as well as the description if you are watching this on YouTube. And I just want to say, Borge, thank you very much for coming on the show. It was awesome having you.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Absolutely. And folks, as always, have fun and happy training.